Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. My name is Mehreen Khan.
And I'm Simon Cooper. This is the football show where we take the hero and we show you the human.
From Johan Cruyff to Megan Rapinoe.
And from George Best to Kylian Mbappe.
This is the Human Football Podcast.
Last week's episode was part 2 of our double-header on Sir Alex Ferguson, in which we asked, was he the greatest post-war leader in any sphere that Britain had? Please be sure to check it out.
Welcome back to Heroes and Humans, where today we are discussing the man who's very likely to lead the US men's national team at their home World Cup in 2026, Argentinian coach Mauricio Pochettino. Poch, as he's very affectionately known by almost everyone, is also very well known to me because, of course, he is a former Chelsea manager.
But everyone is a former Chelsea manager.
Yeah, now that I say that, I don't even think that is a particularly special category because we seem to fire managers every 6 months. There will be a point in this podcast where every single manager that we discuss will have been a former Chelsea manager. Peak Heroes and Humans. But Pochettino is not very well known for his stint at Chelsea, but actually at our, I would say, most hated rivals, Tottenham, where he became the most successful manager in their recent history without actually winning anything. Pochettino took Spurs within 2 games of winning a historic Premier League title. Spoiler, they bottled it. Of course they did. And was achingly close to a Champions League victory after slapping up your Ajax team in that incredible semi-final in 2019, one of the greatest European comebacks that I can remember.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't great. It was horrible, like watching a car crash. But anyway, let's move on. Pochettino.
It was amazing. If you want Simon's full recounting of the story, go back to listen to our Ten Hag episode. Poch seems to have been around in football for a pretty long time. He's only 52, just a year younger than Pep Guardiola. But we're going to ask if his new gig in the US could be the end of his domestic coaching career. How will a coach who's made his reputation for being one of the best at blooding young talent get on with the US men's national team, who are struggling right now? But the average age of their squad was only 23 at the last World Cup in Qatar. They were the youngest team there. We'll also talk about why one of the world's richest men is going to chip in to pay his salary. We'll also discuss the life and career of this farmer's son, who actually is a believer in a very special, I would say, bespoke brand of spiritualism, Pochettinoism. I don't know what we're going to call it. He thinks he has actual superpowers when it comes to reading other human beings and his players, and he really struggles to learn languages. Pochettino, like another manager we discussed, Ancelotti, loves eating, loves drinking, but also forces his players to do some of the most gruesome running and training drills that have ever been seen in modern football. He's also a big crier, something that we've yet to come across in Heroes and Humans. And I'm going to say that he's probably the worst version of himself when he's winning because he's surrounded by a clique of yes men. So, Simon, what are your initial, or I don't know, very well considered thoughts about Pochettino?
I remember a somewhat lumbering defender when I arrived in Paris in 2002. He was playing for Paris Saint Germain. A terrible, terrible team, truly poor.
But a great shirt.
I suppose, yeah, it looked like a kind of nightclub outfit of the late 70s. I remember him as a great celebrator. I mean, he was very animated and
he scored
big
goals
smile.
for a defender.
Yeah, he would score goals sort of through brute force.
We should also just note that we've discussed some pretty storied managers on this podcast. Champions League winners, World Cup winners. Pochettino
is not that.
I mean, maybe it's not his fault, but he really hasn't won much. So, Simon, talk us through some of his sparse statistics as both a player and a manager.
And a man. He was born in Murphy, Argentina, I imagine a place named after an Irish immigrant, in 1972. He played more than 400 top-flight games as a central defender, first in Argentina, and later with Espanyol, Paris Saint Germain, Bordeaux, and then Espanyol again. Won 20 caps for Argentina in the late 90s and early 2000s, and was the long-haired dude who felled one Michael Owen to give away that penalty at the World Cup 2002, which allowed David Beckham to redeem himself as national hero. Mm-hmm. He's only won one major trophy as a manager, Ligue 1, the French title, the Uber Eats League, with Paris Saint Germain in 2022. Although when you have Messi, Neymar and Mbappe playing up front for you, against various French village teams, I think Todd Boehly might have coached that team to glory too. But he did lead arguably the best Spurs team ever in the Premier League, and that is not just damning with faint praise. His Spurs got a record points tally in 2015, 86 points, and got their highest finish in 2016, second, of course, behind Leicester, when they probably should have won it, although winning it would have destroyed Spurs' entire identity. And I think Spurs fans should welcome second place as a narrow escape.
I would also wonder what it would have done to Pochettino's identity, because that would have been by far the greatest achievement, definitely, of his career. But I wonder if he would have stuck around and tried to win more, or would have blown up pretty quickly. But that is a counterfactual.
So Mehreen, as they say on the psychoanalyst sofa, take us back to his childhood.
Mauricio Pochettino is born, as you mentioned, in Murphy, a town which was named, indeed, after an Irish immigrant. The Irish immigrant is John James Murphy, who, according to the folklore of the town, arrived from Wexford in Ireland as a very poor farmer in the 1840s with £1, or there probably wasn't a pound in those days.
A pound was probably worth about, £50,000. But anyway, he was not rich.
He was very rich with a few shillings and left as a very, very rich landowner 30 years later, and they named the town after him. The Pochettino family are also farmers. Mauricio says that when he grows up, he tells everyone that he was middle class, but that's because what Argentinians always say about themselves, that they're middle class. But he very much was not middle class. As a son of a farmer, he was working class because, in his own words, if it was Saturday or Sunday, it didn't matter for us. If a cow or pig goes into labour, you have to be able to see to them whatever day it is. His father's farm is modest. It's 100 hectares, and that's enough for the Pochettino family to produce food for about 2 or 3 families in Murphy and live a pretty modest life. But in more recent years, Argentinian farming families like the Pochettinos really struggle to survive. They have become one of the most poorest and decimated parts of the country because they suffer from huge climate change and a wider economic decline. As his name also suggests, the Pochettinos are of Italian ancestry, like millions and millions of Argentinians. Mauricio's great-grandfather is a first-generation immigrant from Piedmont, and around 2/3 of all Argentinians claim Italian ancestry, which is the highest outside Italy.
And a large number of them are trying to get back to Italy now, lining up at the consulate to get Italian passports.
Which tells you everything about the state of the country's political and economic decline. The young Mauricio is raised in a remote and pretty lawless place. He tells stories about his childhood which have clearly been seared into his memory, often traumatic. One of the first is when he's 10 years old and he's playing football in his local park. And he describes the humiliation of the opposition goalkeeper pulling down his pants in the middle of a match.
Pulling down Pochettino's pants.
Literally pulling down his actual pants, so his shorts and his underwear. And he cries on the field as a little boy. This won't be the last time that Mauricio Pochettino, young or old, is seen crying on the pitch.
This is rural Argentina, farming people. Football is the sport taken immensely seriously. How did he experience that as a young boy?
In his own words, it's a pretty rough, very male-dominated and testosterone environment. Other memories that he has of playing as a young kid over his dad and his granddad, who he would find on the sidelines, basically having punch-ups with the other dads and other granddads because somebody gave them a look that they didn't like the cut of their jib. However, in this kind of rough and tumble environment, which is a bit lawless, I think Pochettino discovers the value of having a close-knit group of protection. And so his grandfather and father, when they're punching people up, are doing it to protect some degree of honor around Mauricio, or, it's about protecting their family name. And this kind of sense of camaraderie is going to be really close to Pochettino because he's marked as a manager. His identity as a manager is that he has a close-knit gang that he creates, 3 or 4 assistant coaches, who he takes everywhere with him. He talks about these guys like they're actually his family members. They travel with him at whatever club he has, and he comes basically with an entourage, which is becoming a bit of a throwback for modern managers who, when they arrive at new clubs, are basically told that they're going to have sporting directors, assistants that are picked by the club for them. Mauricio Pochettino keeps his boys very close with him.
Yeah, I mean, this is the eternal question. Do you trust institutions or do you only trust people you know? In Argentina, as a kind of low-trust society, you trust the people you know. You don't believe in institutions, so your oldest contacts are the ones you value. And football is becoming a much more corporate environment where they say, we are an institution, we have a working organisation, we are hiring you as an individual, but not all your mates. And so he's a bit of a previous generation.
And I think this is a tension that we might come back to when we think about how we might get on with the US men's national team. The young Mauricio plays football, he plays judo and volleyball, the latter because he gets to meet girls. But he is pretty prodigious when it comes to football. And at 13 years old, living in Murphy, he's allowed to train with Central, the big club from Rosario, the biggest city near the village.
And hometown of?
Messi?
Messi.
Yeah. We'll get to Messi a bit later on. Young Mauricio has to take a 3-hour round trip on a bus to go to training after he goes to farming school. He's too young to actually be a full-time young academy player, so he gets to go and train with Central after school. That's a sort of arrangement that he has with his parents. His career as a footballer will take a big leap when he comes to the attention of one Marcelo Bielsa, who is then a youth team coach for the rival club in Rosario, Newell's Old Boys. And this, of course, is I think, on record still, the only Argentinian team that Leo Messi has ever played for. He played for them as a boy before he was scooped up by Barcelona as a young kid. Now, Bielsa is going to become one of the most important and recurring figures in Pochettino's footballing life.
Yeah, a brief word on Marcelo Bielsa.
Yeah, I think he's basically a sort of godfather to a certain style of management, which is become the sort of dominant way that we think about how football should be played. High intensity, high pressing.
Yeah, and he is, among other things, godfather to Pep. So Bielsa is a kind of cousin of the Dutch school of Peppian and Kloppian football.
Well, he's the Latin equivalent of Ralf Rangnick, who also plays this sort of godfather figure in German football or Northern European football about high intensity and high pressing. And a bit like Rangnick, it's former players that then go on to be managers like Pep and like Pochettino, who always credit Bielsa for kind of inculcating them in particular training methods or revolutionizing the way football is played, that they go on to then develop and take to incredible heights in their domestic careers. Bielsa will be known a little bit for, one, being manager of the Argentinian national team. He had a stint at Leeds, which we'll get on to. And I think it's probably getting more credit and more props now in his later life than he ever did, in the early 90s or the 2000s.
Well, he's not a hugely successful coach himself. He's much more significant as an influencer, a thinker on football.
Yes.
And that's his role in Pochettino's life. And also, he is one of the few people who has strong belief in Pochettino, the footballer. He
does, and he is not afraid of tough love, something we'll also come back to a bit later on. So Bielsa, when he is a youth team manager for Newell's, is on the hunt, a hunt he takes very seriously to find kids to bring to the academy. He spends a lot of time sitting in his car with one of his assistants, driving around Rosario and its local area to find boys. That sounds a bit sus, but
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, we all know what I mean. There is rumours that there is a kid in Murphy, a kid who's pretty good at football. And Bielsa doesn't need too much to get into his car and drive to see whatever family is in question.
To use the Hunter S. Thompson phrase, Bielsa is a stone-cold fanatic about football.
Yeah, he can't just go on a website and find the stats of the kid or anything about him. You got to go and see them in person. A very impatient Bielsa can't wait to see this kid from Murphy, so he jumps in his little banger car with his assistant and makes the trip from Rosario to Murphy. But by the time he arrives at the Pochettino's farm, it's 2:00 in the morning.
Which means nothing to Bielsa.
He's like, well, it's dark, so what? He knocks on the door and finds a baffled Mrs. Pochettino, Mauricio's mum, at the door, who's very confused why two blokes in tracksuits want to see her teenage son in the middle of the night. Pochettino, however, describes the fact that Bielsa manages first to charm his mum into getting his dad out the door and then letting his parents let him into the house. At this point, it's 3:00 in the morning and Pochettino's mum and dad don't want to wake the boy. So Bielsa, who is not going to go away empty-handed because it's 3:00 in the morning and he's in Murphy, says, let me just see the boy's legs.
This is going to be a core scene in the Bielsa biopic.
And his parents are like, okay, but just don't wake up the boy. So they lift the bed covers and they show him Mauricio's, I guess, calves at best. I don't know if it went all the way up, but Bielsa doesn't need to see more than the calves. He says, those are the legs of a footballer.
He probably does this all the time. He's always arriving at boys' houses at 2 a.m. and to inspect their legs.
The structure of their calves.
Yeah.
And he's convinced, he thinks, yep, this is the kid, he looks like a footballer, and Pochettino never even stirs from his sleep. So this is a story which is then subsequently told to him by his parents the following morning.
So Poch has good legs. This is a match made in heaven. Bielsa is going to bring him to stardom.
He does. He takes him to Newell's. Bielsa will turn Pochettino from the striker he is, which is what happens when you're just a good player playing with kids in your local town. You get made to be striker because you can score goals. And Pochettino says to him, I want to be a defender. I am a defender. Bielsa doesn't need to hear it again. Puts him in defence. And young Mauricio then moves full-time to play for Newell's and lives in Rosario in a little bunk bed as a teenage boy, very, very far away from home. A very common story for successful players.
He's 14 years old.
He's 14 years old. He's never lived anywhere that's not a farm, and now he's in the bright lights of Rosario. So Poch speaks in pretty vivid terms about his teenage years. A recurring theme that we're going to come to is his spiritualism, and he thinks it starts with this near-death experience he has as a very young teenager in his bedsit.
Bedsit is a very ancient technical English term from the 1970s.
Oh, do people not know what bedsit is? Okay. Well,
if you're young, it's a studio. If you're old, it's a bedsit. If you're old and British.
It's not a very nice place. And in the winters, which are quite harsh in Argentina, he has to use a gas heater in this tiny little apartment. But he has to make sure that he switches it off before he goes to bed because the carbon monoxide would actually kill him. However, I think a young Poch comes home from training, he's knackered, he falls asleep, and then he describes waking up hours later by a force, quote, he says, which tells him to get up and switch the heater off and open the windows and air out the room. Otherwise, he would have died. Now, this force, he doesn't put a name to it. He doesn't say it's God, but he says there's something that compels him to wake up.
The thing might be the gas itself.
It might be the smell, or the sound of your small bedsit filling up with carbon monoxide. But he claims that this is actually the moment where the seeds of some spiritualism or some belief in something bigger than him starts. And it's not a conventional Catholic thing like God or Jesus. He goes on to describe other moments in his life where he thinks that there is this force at play.
I am trying to suspend my intolerance of spiritualism for the course of this episode and be open-minded about it.
If there was one episode that was going to make you more open-minded to it, it's probably not this one, I'll be honest. Even I'm a little bit squeamish about Pochettino talking about his spiritualism. We'll elaborate on what he thinks is really at play a bit later on, because this is something that he will only, I think, really vocalize when he's actually a manager, when he thinks it actually becomes a superpower, not just a religion.
Okay, we will get back to that. For now, let's switch back with relief to football. He makes it into the Newell's first team under Bielsa, and they do very well.
They do. They get to the Copa Libertadores final, the sort of South American equivalent of the Champions League, which for a team like Newell's is pretty big going. He upgrades his heating system, and I think in the climax of his Argentinian domestic career, Pochettino gets to play with the great Maradona. Now, Maradona is going to be a subject for a future Heroes and Humans episode.
Very soon.
Where we describe, I think, the vagaries of his career. But there is a point in Maradona's career when
he's fallen so low that he's playing with Pochettino.
A little bit. He needs to make it to the 1994 World Cup, but he's been kicked out by his current team in Sevilla. They don't want him anymore because he's causing too much trouble. So Argentinian authorities are desperate for the fact that Diego just needs somewhere to train. And he ends up training at Newell's. He ends up playing a little bit with Newell's with Pochettino, who's then club captain. And Poch describes this as just being the kind of sort of a dream come true, right? Like many young boys in Argentina, he grows up with a picture of Maradona on his wall, and he's asked by the club just before Diego's about to arrive, can you call him to tell him, and that you're coming to Newell's, I'm the captain, we'd love to welcome you. And he describes the conversation with Maradona, where Maradona calls him Poche, his sort of little nickname, and he's over the moon. They sleep with each other on game days in their little bunk beds.
They share a room, I think, is more
Yeah, they sleep
accurate.
with each other, yeah.
Right, okay.
Like boys, isn't it?
Okay.
There's nothing sus about that. He gets to train with his idol. If you want to know how the 1994 World Cup ends for Maradona, please be sure to listen to our two-parter, which is coming very soon. Along with playing with Maradona, which actually is not as weird as you think, given how Maradona's career ends up, there are other oddities about playing football in Argentina in the 90s. Poch, while he's a full-time footballer, a professional footballer, still has to do military service. This is because we're only about 10 years after the end of the military junta, but the military service is still in play. This is something that actually comes back to him when he's a manager, because Heung-min Song, South Korean national, also gets called up to do military service at Tottenham 30 years later. And Poch actually manages to make sure that Son gets out of it. I think memories of his own unsuccessful stint.
Poch has high-level contacts in the South Korean military.
Poch knows people.
Right.
I don't think he knows as many people in the Korean peninsula as Sven-Göran Eriksson did, but...
Well, Eriksson's friends were on the wrong side of the peninsula, to be fair.
As a player, Poch he's a pretty good central defender. And like a lot of his peers, he thinks he's going to spend most of his career playing in Argentina. That is the sort of limit of his horizons. But in 1994, he gets a call from Espanyol. I think we can say the lesser team of Catalonia, who are constantly in the shadow of Barcelona. I think now they might even be the third team in Catalonia, because Girona are now good.
Overtaken them. Yeah, Espanyol are kind of the wrong side of the tracks inside Barcelona. They're a sort of small working class club that can never be the biggest team in their city.
But it is the club that he falls in love with, and it's the city that he falls in love with, because while he's with Newell's, they play some friendlies in Barcelona. He goes to the city during the Olympics in 92, and he says he falls in love with the place.
Correctly so.
Even though the wages are terrible, and he says that he's got better offers from better clubs in South America, he wants to make the jump to Spain.
And therefore, we have this weird coincidence, or maybe it's not a coincidence, that he's spending his prime years of his playing career in Barcelona, so from about 1994 to 2000, at the same time as all the other great coaches of his generation, Guardiola, Mourinho, Louis van Gaal, Luis Enrique, Xavi, maybe not great
not
coaches,
Xavi.
all of them, but major coaches, are also in town learning from Johan Cruyff.
To be fair to him, he doesn't ever really describe having encounters with the figures that you've just mentioned.
They were too big for him. They wouldn't have been interested in encountering him, but he might have seen them play.
Sure. I mean, his main memory that he describes at Espanyol against Barcelona is when he is defending the great Brazilian Ronaldo, R9, and he manages to shutter him out in a couple of games. And I think that is the sort of highlight of his encounter with this brilliant Barcelona team, is the fact that he has to defend against some of the best attackers in the world. When Bielsa arrives in 1998, Pochettino describes himself at being at a point in his career when he's become lost and lazy. And Bielsa's the guy that whips him into shape. He describes an encounter when Bielsa is at training, and Bielsa is actually the godfather of these punishing, grueling training regimes where he makes his players run kilometers and kilometers. One of the drills that he develops, Bielsa, is called murder ball, which is where you play a full-size game, but the ball is never allowed to go out of play. So as soon as the ball is out, somebody throws it back in. So you're just playing constantly without any sort of break, without any pause in play, and without taking breath.
This is like a nightmare of football.
And Bielsa is somehow managed to do this for about 30 years straight. At any club that he's been to, he inculcates exactly this kind of brutal training regime. But Bielsa thinks that Pochettino, who's captain of Espanyol, has gone soft, and he berates him at training because he thinks he is lost and lazy. And Pochettino cries. Of course he does. Pochettino says, "I went home in tears." This is after he's been bollocked by Bielsa on the training ground at Espanyol as the captain. "I've never felt so embarrassed as I've ever felt in front of someone. Everything he said was right. I'd been blinded, trapped in my own world, and I'd stopped doing what had got me there in the first place." This is also, I think, betrays Pochettino's pretty tough attitude that he takes towards himself. He's very, very self-critical. He doesn't often give himself a break, but he also is a little bit self-pitying, hence all of the crying.
So he has more years under Bielsa now as a mature player, absorbing this Dutch Guardiolan style pressing game. And that, I guess, will become the basis of his own thinking as a manager. So he gets sort of Barcelona football by this long detour back from Rosario. Bielsa comes from Rosario, importing Barcelona thinking to Espanyol.
At this point, however, Pochettino has no thoughts about being a manager. But after he's got his ass whooped by Bielsa, he picks himself up and he comes to the attention of foreign clubs. And he ends up moving to PSG to play in a team which has the likes of Nicolas Anelka and a young Ronaldinho in it.
Yes, it is also a completely dysfunctional team in which neither Anelka nor Ronaldinho perform. And most of the crowd are out of control hooligans. There is a white stand and a non-white stand.
Jeez.
There are no away fans typically in French football.
By white, you mean race?
What is the technical term in race science? Caucasian stand and a non-Caucasian stand. How can I say it more clearly? There are white skinheads at the Bologna end.
Yeah.
And then there are non-whites at the Etoile end. And because there are no away fans, the PSG fans just fight with each other. And they have these chants against the other end. So it's a very bizarre environment.
And so it's nothing like the kind of glamorous, trendy PSG that we've known for the last decade or so, where Beckham and Kim Kardashian and Kanye West are around.
I mean, they have this idea that because it's Paris, you need to buy a superstar. So that's how Anelka and Ronaldinho end up there. But there are no structures. There's no proper team. The players are terrified of the fans. So it's a terrible place to play football. So Poch and I arrive in Paris at about the same time. He's there just before me. And I think in the ultimate humiliation, the lowest point of his career, he wins the Intertoto Cup.
Big up.
With Paris Saint Germain in 2001.
So the Intertoto Cup is like a European cup that is not the Champions League and it's not the UEFA Cup. It's probably the Conference League, isn't it?
But it's played in summer. It's a kind of pre-season cup.
Oh yeah, well, Chelsea won it once.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was quite a big deal for me when we weren't winning anything else. But Pochettino is rewarded by Bielsa, who's now Argentinian national team coach, and gets a call to the 2002 World Cup, the first and last World Cup that Pochettino will play in. I have looked through some of his clips, or his highlights reel, as the kids say, and there's not that much of Pochettino, who's got long, a bit kind of greasy hair and wears a headband at his time with the Argentinian national team. The only thing that really ever comes up,
The highlight of his career, I think.
or the low light of his life probably at that point, is a tackle that he does on a certain young diminutive Michael Owen in the group stages of the World Cup against England. It was a dive.
Big up to Owen.
Owen throws himself to the floor, and the great Pier Luigi Collina, the referee, doesn't see it. He gives the penalty. Beckham scores. He does that incredible shirt grabbing thing, the red shirt that they wear. And, vengeance is served. This is all a grudge match after the 98 World Cup where Beckham is sent off.
I hadn't realised that Owen got 2 penalties against Argentina 4 years apart at World Cups. That takes some doing.
Owen was quite something. Pochettino to this day describes the fact that he was robbed and it was never a penalty, and he was right. This is far, far before the days of VAR.
This tackle, and generally my memories of Pochettino as a defender, it makes me think of Garrincha, the
Yes.
great Brazilian winger.
Yes.
When he was asked, who were you playing against? Who was your marker? He would say, I don't know, João. It was a kind of his generic for
boot Bob.
big defender who I turned inside out. Didn't have any trouble with him. And when Garrincha would describe his dribbles, he'd say, so João comes at me and I go left past João, then another João comes. And to me, Pochettino is that João, this kind of big, slightly clumsy.
I think the kids would call Pochettino an NPC. And if you know, you know.
Tell me, NPC?
NPC is a non-playable character. So it's the sort of people in video games that just make up the background, right?
That's fantastic. I'll use that for the rest of my life.
Please don't use that, because
I know
it's going to be so
NPCs.
cringe if you call people NPCs. But Pochettino in the FIFA world of football is very much an NPC defender.
That has just enlarged my vocabulary, I think, durably. NPC.
Your
right.
kids will know about it. They'll probably call you an NPC. Right.
Almost certainly. I think what we have at this point is a very forgettable defender who would not live in memory. And the one thing that elevates his career and points us forward to his future is that all the big moments of his career at Rosario, later at Espanyol, then at the World Cup 2002, happened under Marcelo Bielsa. Bielsa coached that 2002 Argentinian team. They were going to win the World Cup. They were a wonderful team, etc.
They should have won the World Cup.
They go out in the first round. The players, I think, are then told to get home themselves, however they can work it out.
From South Korea and Japan.
So this was the team that was supposed to win the World Cup. So anyway, it hasn't been a good career, but he has found Bielsa, who is a rare person with very strong ideas about football. Pochettino probably didn't have very clear ideas about how football should be played. And so what do? You meet this very articulate, convincing guy who bangs on all day about how football should be played. Of course, you absorb that. So he is kind of learning Bielsaism from the man himself again and again and again. And that will become the basis of who he is as a manager.
At this point in his life, football is very important, but there are a couple of other things that are really, really important to him. They are food and wine, especially.
I'm warming to him.
Okay, well, so Poch, who spends about nearly 2 seasons at PSG, gets a call up for Bordeaux, who said, do you want to come and play for us? He doesn't really know where Bordeaux is, but he knows that it's got something to do with wine. So he actually says that he goes to Bordeaux just because of his love for wine. His primary motivation is to spend a lot of time in the vineyards there, to become a bit of a connoisseur. And he sort of bonds with the club chairman, who also owns a vineyard. Pochettino is obsessed with wine, not something that I can really relate to. But he says that even when he was at PSG, his landlord in the apartment that he stayed at also produced wines, and he was just guzzling champagne and regional wines on a almost daily basis, which
Right.
I guess as a footballer in the early 2000s was not really frowned upon.
No, as a French football, I would say was almost compulsory.
So a bit like Carlo Ancelotti, and we discussed this in the Ancelotti episode, food and drink are a huge part of Pochettino's life. And the life that he creates in clubs also will end up revolving around food. Definitely as a manager, this is the case, but it's not always, let's put it this way, healthy. So I think, when he's low, he does comfort eating or binge eating, is that what you can call it? And he says that when he's had bad games, he will slump on a sofa and just eat crisps and pizza and drink too much. Quote, he says, whenever I am slightly down, I like to smell Argentinian wine because it makes me happy. It takes me back to my country and to the recognizable places that I grew up as a boy. I mean, I don't want to cast aspersions, but like food is playing a big role in healing him, I think.
Yeah, it's better than spiritualism.
Again, not to cast too many aspersions, but let's talk a little bit about the way Poch looks. And Poch has he's got a round face with sort of cherubic cheeks.
He has that very Argentinian, very long hair, which I think in Argentina is an expression of masculinity. And he has this cherubic face. So he looks a little bit like a rocker gone to seed, I would say.
I think what happens is that when he puts on a bit of weight, it all goes to his face first. You know, I think that's his genetic makeup. And this kind of porcine chubbiness, I think, one, it makes him look much younger than he is. And, you know, we can contrast this with the sort of maniacal fitness demands that Bielsa puts on him as a manager, and then he will then put on his own players when he's a coach. Pochettino teams, like Bielsa teams, are known for clocking up the most kilometers on a pitch. And I'm not sure, but I'm going to say that his attitudes towards food and drink, his, I think, weakness for indulgence, also has this other side where he himself will go on very strict diets. His weight often goes up and down. You can see that if you just trace his life for the last couple of years. Sometimes he's a bit podgy, sometimes he's a bit less podgy. He wears it all on his face. And so I think because of this relationship with food, like tracking Pochettino's weight, not to sound like a complete weirdo, but it's quite a good proxy.
Stalkerish.
I think it could be a good proxy for how he's getting on. So if you're a US men's national team fan and you spot Pochettino in Chick-fil-A, that's probably because something's gone really, really wrong. So I think Pochettino has much more of a love-hate relationship with food than Ancelotti, who sort of embraces it in its fullness and everything that it means for his life and his longevity.
So he's a fat man with a thin man screaming to get out, as the cliche goes.
I don't think there is a thin man screaming to get out. I'm really sorry. But we know that there's a dark side to his relationship with food because of how he treats his players. So at Tottenham, he'll set up Fat Club.
Is it called Fat Club?
It's actually called Fat Club, which is literally a group of players that he thinks are overweight, and he puts them on special training regimes.
They clearly don't have a human resources manager because this is not allowed in modern corporations.
Well, so Kieran Trippier, who signs for Tottenham, goes on holiday before his transfer to Mexico. Kieran Trippier is a pretty slim looking dude, thinks he's quite fit, turns up and then gets his fat literally pinched by the Tottenham assistant coaches.
Yeah.
Not calipers,
just with their fingers.
The finger test, a bit like you and Gareth Southgate.
Me and Gareth Southgate, yeah.
And gets told that he's got too high of a body fat. And Trippier's like, there's absolutely no way. Like, I'm a fit player. But he spends a couple of weeks in Fat Club. And in Fat Club, you have to do extra running. You have to spend time in altitude chambers. And you have to basically get to a level where when Poch is pinching your tummy, there's not enough.
I'm very relieved I did not sign for Spurs in the Pochettino era.
I don't think you would have signed for Spurs in any era. And if you want a full version of how Simon had his body fat literally pinched off his body in front of Gareth Southgate, listen to our episode on the former England manager.
In Heroes and Humans, we try to peer into the person's soul. And in Pochettino's soul, so far, there's a lot of food. Mm-hmm. There's Marcelo Bielsa. And there's also spiritualism.
There's something, an energy, an aura. Let's go back to his playing career, which wraps up back at Espanyol. It eventually ends in a bit of ignominy. He's kicked out by the coach, Ernesto Valverde.
Great man.
Very great man. Not actually the father of the Real Madrid Valverde. They're not even related.
No, not even from the same country.
I mean, he's Uruguayan, yeah. But Pochettino will go off and get his coaching badges. In 2009, however, Espanyol are in big trouble. And they appoint former player, untested manager, Pochettino, to become their coach. The 13th coach they'll have in 11 years in 2009 because they're about to get relegated. Poch's first game as a manager in any level of football is against Pep Guardiola's Barcelona, local rivals. Well, not even rivals, basically.
No.
Big brother, dominant Catalonian team. And they get a very respectable draw. He's very proud of that. But they're still stuck to the bottom of the table, 8 points from safety. Poch needs a miracle, so he straps on his boots to go and find one.
He's going to create his own miracle. No, he's not going to create it on the field. You mean he straps on boots that are not football boots?
Literally is hiking boots and goes to find his miracle. This is a story which has been told quite a lot, but I'm going to recount the great Sid Lowe, who writes for The Guardian, who says that Pochettino packed his bags, got his wife, and his number two, of course, his assistant, and he hikes 12 kilometres to Montserrat. Have you been to Montserrat?
I have seen it from the distance. I myself do not do religious hikes, but
It's kind of pretty well known as a mountain town, a very religious mountain town, which is surrounded by shrines. And the, I guess, saint of choice is the Black Virgin. So in Montserrat, Pochettino goes to visit the shrine of the Black Virgin, which was apparently found in the 9th century. But by visiting the shrine, Pochettino is actually, and Sidlow says, continuing a long tradition of footballing superstition, which is pleading to the Virgin to save the region's other forgotten club, Espanyol. And she did.
The Virgin says, all right, Espanyol should stay up.
Because in their next game, Pochettino, who's trekked all the way down after having probably a really nice lunch and a really nice dinner, win their next game over Racing Santander 1-0. It means they get off the bottom of the table for the first time in a month and they end up surviving. Pochettino's pilgrimage is a success.
It worked. But he's not, let's say, a classic traditional Catholic.
This is not conventional religion, right? So I think the Montserrat thing makes us think, oh, well, he's just a Christian. That's what they do. People in Spain, they go to Montserrat to pray at the feet of the Virgin. But this is not Pochettino. He talks about something else, something that he's given a name to. Energia universal, or universal energy.
Energia
universal, which is some belief in like the fact that everything is connected.
Yeah, it's what people without any religious education and without any rigor in their thinking like to say, yeah, man, everything is connected.
Pochettino is super convinced that this thing is real because he says it crops up everywhere in his life, including when Espanyol open their incredible state-of-the-art new stadium while he's coach, and they host a pre-season match against Liverpool. And Poch says that he's standing in the empty stadium before the first ever game, before a ball has ever been kicked, and he says a bird flies into the stadium. He catches it in his hand, flush, and then lets it go. And he said that I'd seen exactly that scene in my dreams.
Right, okay, this is proof.
It's kind of cute, huh?
It's proof there isn't a universal energy. I take it back. I'm convinced now.
So everything is connected, he says. Nothing happens without causality. Something is always the consequence of something else. He says that when he's manager of Tottenham, this is the reason that Harry Kane always scores in derby. So he always scores against Arsenal. And I'm like, I think he always scores against Arsenal because he's just very good at scoring goals.
He scores a lot of goals, yeah.
And when he's playing against Arsenal, he has to score because he's like super hyped up. But let's talk about managers and God, because we have spoken in previous episodes about the fact that Jurgen Klopp is a practicing Catholic. Thomas Tuchel is a Ayurvedic wellness guru.
Oh my God.
And Poch is kind of quasi-religious. It kind of goes beyond just the belief in the energy because he thinks that this energy thing is a superpower. He thinks that understanding auras and connectedness means that he really understands people. So he says, do I believe in God? Yes, because my parents baptized me, etc., etc. However, I do think that there's an external force that differs from God, or the God of Catholic teaching. Ever since I was a boy, and let's go back to that near-death experience he has, I've been convinced that the universe conspires to help you fulfill your dreams.
This is clearly not true of everybody in the universe.
It's true for his own version of his own life story. So he says decisions and personal relationships and everything else are a matter of energy, good or bad, small or large. When I was PSG captain, I spent countless hours speaking to our fitness coach, Feliciano Di Blasi, who would analyze individuals through their auras. He'd share his experience with me and I was fascinated.
This is just the worst. This is the biggest pile of nonsense that I've encountered so far in Heroes and Humans, and that's saying something.
That is quite a lot. But he says, I gradually learned how to develop this sixth sense.
Oh, God.
He says, I need data and tests, but what influences my decisions more is my ability to see if the right energy is flowing. I can foresee things that are going to happen and the associated consequences or which path each player is going to take. I can see it in their auras.
This level of bullshit leaves me speechless. I just don't know what to say.
Auras have become quite fashionable, but
yes, they have, but I don't know where to begin.
So even me, who's obviously a bit partial to beliefs in bigger things, I am seeing basically basic white girl energy stuff here, right? Healing energies, crystals, astrology. That's what it's giving me.
You know that New Age has become quite a big market in the US, and they have these kind of Saturday fairs where you can buy crystals at inflated prices or candles that give you
I think
energy.
he's probably going to end up in California, isn't he?
New Mexico, yeah.
Having said that, I think there's a couple of things to know. One is that it's probably a testament to how much football has changed and liberalised, I guess, that Pochettino is not ridiculed for this kind of stuff. Like, he talks about it very openly, especially when he was in England. And this gives me throwbacks to poor Glenn Hoddle, who was pilloried for his belief in, I think, The supernatural?
He believed in the laying on of hands by the mother of his ex-girlfriend, Eileen Drury, who was going to cure England players. And he was ridiculed for that. But Hoddle was in fact sacked for saying that disabled people were paying for sins they had committed in former lives.
Yeah.
Hoddle, like Pochettino, is not following traditional Christian teachings here.
But Hoddle is obviously pilloried for it,
Yes.
loses his job for it. With Pochettino, no one cares. I do wonder why. Maybe because he's foreign, so like he's allowed to be a bit zany.
I also think that because Pochettino has spent most of his career not quite at the top of football, with apologies to Tottenham, to some degree he is ignored and overlooked a lot of the time. So you can babble and people don't pay that much attention until you get to the very top of football. So, in fact, researching this episode and hearing you talk about Poch, I'm learning a lot about somebody who has been around for a very long time.
Yes, and we're going to get onto this a bit later, but I think that this superpower stuff is actually him compensating for the fact that he doesn't have another superpower, which is his inability to speak languages.
I think that also may be a general truth about people who believe in their ability to read energy or who feel they're in touch with spiritualism. It's a compensation for not having other
communication skills. But I think it's pretty natural for managers to sort of believe in something higher, because the nature of their job is that they do put in a lot of work, but ultimately when the main thing is happening, they're not in control.
Alex Ferguson thinks he always is in control. He is also
I think he might
religious.
also be the only one that is really in control. So they sort of have to watch their fate play out. So it's quite a humbling job. So I'm not surprised that Klopp and Tuchel and Pochettino are predisposed to some belief in something higher than themselves. I think it probably is a little bit comes with the territory when such a humbling job that you know that you're not the master of your own fate.
Okay, I will live with your greater tolerance for things of the spirit than mine. Let's go back to Pochettino and football. He does keep Espanyol up. They tread water for a while. And then somehow he gets noticed by the Premier League. In England, a country with which he has no association, has never played, is unknown, and which has a language, English, that he does not speak. Remarkably, he goes there and it works. Join us after the break to find out how very quickly the man with the sixth sense comes to be regarded as one of the most promising coaches in Europe.
Não é tempo técnico, mas é intervalo aqui no podcast. Já imaginou se seu time tivesse um seguro para não perder nunca? Pois é, isso não existe. Mas com a Zurich Seguros, quem não perde nunca é você. Na Zurich Seguros, os planos se adequam às suas necessidades em qualquer momento da sua vida. Seja seguro de auto, residência, vida e muito mais. Diferente de alguns times, na Zurich Seguros você pode confiar. Para saber mais, acesse zurich.com.br ou consulte seu corretor.
This is a reminder that you're listening to Heroes and Humans of Football with me, Simon Cooper.
And me, Mehreen Khan. Welcome back to Heroes and Humans, where you join us in 2012, where Mauricio Pochettino is in his fourth season at Espanyol. He's turned them from relegation fodder into a solid mid-table team in La Liga, but his fourth and final season gets off to a bad start and he's booted out in November. Pochettino knows that he's probably already on his way out from the club that he played for and captained, and thinks it's time to take some English lessons now that he's going to be on a prolonged mid-season break.
So he learns to say universal energy.
Yeah, with a Cockney accent. So he actually hires an English teacher who he's going to take up for about 3 to 6 months in the new year, in January, and he's planning to spend a bit more time with his wife and his young kids. However, Southampton, who are then a team that has just been promoted to the Premier League, and their chairman, Nicola Cortese, come calling. That's because they've sacked Nigel Atkins, the legendary manager who won them back-to-back promotions. But now Southampton are struggling again, and they want Pochettino. Pochettino describes his first reaction when he speaks on the phone to Nicola is, "Where is Southampton?"
Good question.
The second is, "I don't speak English, my head is going to explode." A little bit dramatic. He tells his family that he doesn't want to go to Southampton. He's got this plan to, chill out with the family and learn English. And he is really sort of acutely aware of the need to communicate with his players. So his assistant, his stalwart assistant, Jesus Perez, does speak English. And it's Jesus and his wife who eventually convince him that he has to take the job at Southampton. He joins them in January 2013 and will become only, weirdly I realised, the second Argentinian manager to manage in England after Ozzy Ardiles, his mate and Tottenham legend.
Maradona tried to become the second after Ardiles and had great hopes of going to Blackburn and Aston Villa. We'll come to this in our Maradona episodes. But Blackburn and Aston Villa, deciding that discretion was the better part of wisdom.
So England,
abandoned
not
behind-
a hothouse for Argentinian managers. Let's put it that way. Which
No,
actually I
not
just
exactly.
discovered. Actually, it's weird but true. Pochettino, in his first 3 months at Southampton, end up beating reigning champions Manchester City, my beloved Chelsea, and Liverpool, and end up finishing a very, very comfortable 14th. In his second season, and eventually his last season at Southampton, they finish 8th, which is their highest ever league finish in the Premier League era.
But he still does not speak English.
Yes. Despite all the successes, Pochettino uses a translator. So you had this actually very bizarre choreography of Pochettino and his translator wherever he goes. So this is the post-match press conference, this is the pre-match press conference, this is the interviews with Sky Sports. And this is kind of just not really a done thing, even in England. So the last person that turned up with a translator of any repute was Claudio Ranieri, who was managing my beloved Chelsea. And I know this as a fan, and I felt it quite acutely, that Ranieri was basically a figure of fun because he couldn't speak English.
He learned decent English by the end.
So when he ends up winning the Premier League with Leicester, he still has this heavily accented Italian English accent. But initially he doesn't speak English. And this is kind of weird. But I also think it's one of the reasons that he sort of goes under the radar. And we mentioned this in part 1.
Pochettino, you mean?
Pochettino goes under the radar. He's underestimated when he arrives because nobody knows anything about this guy and they can't talk to him. And Nicola Cortese, who is the chairman of Southampton, actually thinks this is not too bad a thing. And he tells Pochettino, there's no rush for you to learn English, right? I'd rather you learn English when you know exactly what you're saying than saying silly things because you don't have a full grasp on the language. Pochettino tells the story of when he meets Roy Hodgson,
Who is very good with languages.
and probably is fluent in Swedish, I imagine.
Yes. I've not spoken Swedish to Roy Hodgson, but I have read that this is true.
I think that's a bucket list thing we need to do. It's probably a bucket list thing for Roy Hodgson to speak Swedish with you.
To avoid all doubt, I do not speak Swedish.
Roy Hodgson tells Pochettino, look, just stick to your interpreter. Not speaking English makes you a little bit more mysterious.
I have a whole theory, which I'm not going to expound here, that not speaking a language is often an advantage. But Pochettino clearly believes this too.
Is this part of your experience of moving to France? Pochettino at this point, I think, still thinks, however, it's a handicap for him. And let's be honest, we've spoken about incredibly successful managers before, like Mourinho and Klopp and Tuchel and Guardiola, for whom communication, even in their second and sometimes third language, English, is really their superpower. They're incredibly precise with their use of language. They're incredibly pointed with their use of language. And this is part of their aura, actually, in their pre- and post-match press conferences. They're compelling to watch. Poch, however, has none of these skills. And I'll be honest, even now, he's still not very good. Despite playing at PSG, he also never learns French. And when he's a manager, this ends up with quite bizarre situations where there are some players that he literally just can't communicate with. At Tottenham, he describes an encounter with Georges, Kevin and Koundou, who can't actually speak English and only speaks French. But Poch thinks he can understand Spanish, so he's actually trying to bring him on as a sub in a game and is screaming at him, giving him instructions. And
So
Koundou has
Poch
absolutely
may
no
be
idea.
The only Spanish speaker who has spent years living in France and can't speak French, because it's really hard not to learn French if you can already speak Spanish, given that the word overlap between the two languages is about 90%.
Hey,
They're
Poch.
about as similar as two Western languages get.
I know, it shouldn't be that hard, right?
It's like saying I can speak Swedish, but I can't speak Norwegian. It's completely incomprehensible.
Mate, Poch speaks a language of food and wine, That's his chosen method of communication, I think. But actually, he ends up having quite a relaxed attitude towards learning English because he's never forced to learn English, first by Cortese, by Roy Hodgson, and later Daniel Levy. He says that he also doesn't force it onto his players, but then he makes a remark but they pick up very, very quickly, which also might be in contrast to himself.
So there may have been major communication issues during those 5 years at Spurs, which we'll come to.
There is a connection now with the previous theme we spoke about, with the religion, right? So he thinks that he doesn't need English because he's got the other thing. He's got the superpower. He's got the aura reading abilities. He's got the energy, bro.
I suppose it must be very comforting if you have no idea what people are saying. If you deal with people every day and you have never understood a sentence they say, comforting to think that you can read their auras.
Non-verbal communication is a thing, right? Obviously.
Right.
It's a thing.
Clearly it's his only thing.
And it's his crutch, right? So there's so many examples of this. And the first one is with Adam Lallana, who is 24 years old and the captain of Southampton when Pochettino arrives in mid-season. But Pochettino says that he looks at Lallana and Lallana is down. There's something wrong with him. His shoulders are slumped. He never smiles. He looks like he's got the weight of the world on his shoulders. And Pochettino just doesn't end up really playing him that much, even though he's the captain. So he asks him, I don't know in what language, he says, look, Adam, is there something going on with your private life? And Lallana ends up communicating.
Maybe they used one of those
Signals?
apps,
No, just
apps
Google
that you have on
Translate.
smartphones now. Yeah.
Actually, he uses it, but he asks his assistants to find out what's going on with Adam Lallana. And he works out that Adam is basically really struggling with the captaincy. And to quote Pochettino, he says, I spoke through hugs, through contact, and through my facial expressions and my gestures. My poor English forced me to find other ways to read people, which suited me just fine. It suited him because he's got a superpower.
Right. Okay.
He's like the Marvel hero who's discovering that actually he can, I don't know, become invisible or see into the future. And it's his handicap, English, that he turns into a superpower.
Yeah. I mean, to me, so far, he appears to be the manager without qualities, but I am open to persuasion. Let's go on.
He's fully convinced that he has these qualities. And to be honest to him, Southampton end up playing this incredibly thrilling, intense and very organised brand of pressing football, something that is very rare for newly promoted teams to do and to do well. He does it with almost no transfer budget, and despite the fact that he's basically just an unknown quantity for everyone, for fans, for rival managers, for the rest of the Premier League.
Maybe the interpreter is a genius.
We need to find out who the interpreter is. In his second season at Southampton, the first full season he'll have as Southampton manager, is successful enough for a certain Daniel Levy, then Tottenham chairman, to take the gamble, to call up Pochettino, I don't know in what language, and say, I want you. Because Daniel Levy wants this high-octane, very stylish brand of football that Spurs are supposed to be good at.
He arrives at Spurs in 2014. The 5 years at Tottenham until 2019 are peak Poch, where we see a certain glimmer of greatness as a manager, one has to admit, and perhaps even as a human. So what does he do right, and which may then, bode well for the US men's national team, which I would say currently looks even worse than Spurs?
Yes, I think Tottenham, we have to rely on his time as Tottenham as peak Poch, because this is when he's got time and years to impose whatever it is that Pochettinoism is on a group of players, and he's never managed to do that anywhere since. So what does he do? First is, of course, the grueling training sessions. He develops, I guess, his own version of murder ball, which is the Bielsa training regime. One of them is the Gasson test, which is like a bleep test, but basically on speed. This is where he makes his players run 150 meters in 45 seconds with a 15-second break.
Which doesn't sound too demanding, given that, you can run 100 meters in 10 seconds. Not me, admittedly.
But then you have to do it over and over again, and every time you add 6 meters, and your break gets shorter and shorter. He knows this works because in that Southampton team that he leaves in his second season, they will become the Premier League team that covered the most amount of kilometers.
Johan Cruyff always says, I don't care how many kilometers they cover. I want to know, are they running in the right direction?
That's a pretty good point. I think they also do happen to be running in the right direction because they're pressing a lot. Spurs under Pochettino between 2014 and 2019 are consistently first or second for distance covered. So he gets his players ultra fit. And he does this one by putting them through fat camp and having this very fastidious, maniacal sense of monitoring what players are doing. And Hugo Lloris, who is French goalkeeper and captain later, describes that when Poch turns up with one of his assistants, Jesus Perez, they actually record everything that the players are doing in the gym. So they have data on how long you're spending at the treadmill, how many calories you're burning, what incline you're running at. And the players absolutely hate it because it's like living in a sort of controlled lab environment, right? It's a police state. You have to do your kilometers before you're allowed to touch the ball. He says that the players complained. They thought they were going to die. Some of them said that they would faint. And of course, the beginning is really tough. But then I think the tipping point comes in that first season when Spurs are playing Arsenal, their mighty rivals. They go from 1-0 down to 2-1 up, and they score a winner in the 95th minute because they can just keep running when Arsenal can't.
Yeah, I would say this is one data point. I'm not fully convinced at this point.
Well, given that you saw them in the Ajax match when they
did
were
keep
still
going, and
playing
Ajax did not.
in the 90th minute, this becomes very a characteristic feature of Poch's teams. The training sessions are also very personalised. So where the fatties have to go off and do their own training, if you're not a fatty, you get even more elite level training.
Heroes and Humans does not yet have a human resources manager, but as soon as we do, you're in big trouble.
I can't say fatty. So this is how Kieran Trippier, as we mentioned, ends up in fat camp. While there are ultra fit players, Harry Kane being one of them, when he arrives or when he breaks through from the academy into Pochettino's team, Harry Kane finds out that he actually has one of the highest body fat percentages of all at 18% in 2014, which is Pochettino's first season. Harry Kane will then get under his own special personalised training regime and ends up being the fittest player in the squad. Now looking back 10 years later, Harry Kane in his 30s is still playing football at a very elite level. He is
Although
developed.
not admittedly during Euro 2024, but otherwise, yes.
He's killing it by Munich, and that's probably testament. I think his longevity is definitely testament to some of the training regimes that Pochettino imposes.
Okay, so he's turned Spurs into a kind of boot camp. But this is a club that doesn't like spending money. Daniel Levy, the club chairman, hates
Notorious.
any transfer spending. And he's also having to pay for their beautiful new ground. How does Pochettino cope with this constraint that would have other managers whining and whining at press conferences for years?
Completely fine. At the beginning, Pochettino loves the fact that he's got no money to spend. This is super important for Daniel Levy because, as you said, they've got this incredible state-of-the-art stadium which has saddled them with debt. Tottenham in 2018 will become the first ever Premier League team to make no summer signings that year. They try for a certain Jack Grealish, but their bid of 25 million is rejected by Aston Villa.
And Villa probably still laughing about that now.
In this following January transfer window, so the winter, they also make no player additions. Now, Levy, of course, for whom being frugal, I guess, is a virtue of the highest order.
It is the ultimate virtue, yes.
Loves Pochettino for this, right? He loves Pochettino for this because Levy is constantly badgered by fans for the fact that he doesn't invest enough in the club. So Levy says, if I left it totally to Mauricio, we'd probably just have 11 players. I respect the fact that he's definitely not the type of manager who wants to spend money. I know some fans and the media think we have to spend every time. But every time Tottenham have done a big transfer, generally speaking, those players haven't been the best performing. It's those players we've bought below the radar for not a lot of money who give us better performances. Now, of course, Daniel Levy is going to say this. Daniel Levy has a vested interest in making sure that they don't spend too much money because he's got no money.
Well, also, he may have read Tokenomics, in which we point out that club success is predicted by wage spending, not by transfer spending, because as Levy says, loads of transfers go wrong. Just have good players, pay them a lot of money, and if they want to leave, pay them more money.
I think the reality is Tottenham is they actually do end up spending, or under Levy's tenure, end up spending loads of money on transfers, but they just buy really bad players. The other part of Poch that makes him so, I think, amenable to Levy is because he doesn't want to spend money. Why? Because Poch loves the idea of blooding young talent. He is, as well as being an aura reader, he has a very special relationship with younger players. He loves academy players because, in his words, it's like planting a tree, watering it and watching it grow. All the fruit that it bears comes from the land and the environment that you put in its place. He's a farmer's son at the end of the day, you know? In this era, Tottenham will blood Harry Kane, Andros Townsend, Harry Winks, Ryan Mason, Danny Rose, and sign young players like Dele Alli and Eric Dyer. So he's a manager that likes youth because ultimately he knows that younger players are just more pliable. You don't have to untrain them out of their bad habits. If you inculcate them into the strict training regime, they become hyper fit and they'll stop complaining because it will just become normal for them. So he sees the value in youth, not from, I think, just purely the Arsene Wenger perspective because younger players are cheaper and they're decent assets. But I think he thinks that he has a better connection with younger players. And the third feature that makes Poch successful at Tottenham is the fact that he's got his gang. He's got his boys, the thing that he learned to have with him when he was growing up in rough and tumble of Murphy, which is to have people around you that you know and you trust and who protect you.
You trust people, not institutions.
And so his superpower now is the people that he has around him. And we've mentioned a couple of them. His assistant, his long-standing assistant, his stalwart is Jesus Perez. He has a fitness coach, Miguel D'Agostino, who actually played with him in Newell's all of those decades back. Tony Jimenez is his goalkeeping coach. And his son, Sebastian, will end up being the youngest sports scientist ever hired by a Premier League team, Tottenham, when he's 22 years old. Sebas will also come and join him at Chelsea. So his son is now part of his boy gang.
Of course, the son has been selected purely on grounds of meritocratic competition.
But when Pochettino signs contracts, he says, these are my boys. If you want me, we all come as a package. And he's been remarkably consistent in that wherever he's gone.
It's very football 2007.
Yeah. So Pochettino takes his footballing family wherever he goes. They start off at Spurs, of course. Then he's at Paris and in Chelsea. And he's also super family-oriented. So he often speaks about his wife, Karina, as an extended part of his coaching staff. So she often will give players advice on nutrition and training. But of course, there is a downside to this. And that's when things go wrong. Pochettino's superpower, his boys, his boy group, are often just his yes men. They are people that are unable to tell him where he's going wrong, why he's going wrong. They have such loyalty and sort of bonds between each other.
Well, their whole careers depend on him as well.
Yes, they are basically his hangers-on. Of course, I'm sure they're talented in their own rights, but as we saw with Nepo baby Seabass, if his dad doesn't have a job, Seabass is also going to struggle to have a job. And I think the yes men critique comes into play probably in his second and third season. So in his second full season at Spurs, Poch should win the league, right? Tottenham are better than lowly, unfancied Leicester. They get to the end of the season, they're within a couple of points of Leicester. All they have to do is make sure they don't drop too many points, and they will win the league for the first time in the Premier League era. Easily the biggest triumph that Daniel Levy will have ever had at Tottenham.
And the biggest of Poch's career by far.
Definitely. And as you said, turn around this image of Spurs as being Spursy. Being Spursy is always bottling it. But they do bottle it. And it starts at Chelsea in this incredible match called the Battle of the Bridge, which is one of the most violent spectacles, most highly charged encounters I can remember.
Even between Chelsea and Spurs.
And there's nothing to play for Chelsea. The only thing Chelsea are playing for is to stop Tottenham winning the league, which, is a pretty big thing to play for, to be honest.
It's like the biggest thing in Chelsea's history.
So in that game, Tottenham will go 1-0 up. They'll end up losing it to a fantastic winner from Eden Hazard in the second half. The game ends with a brawl where both sides, coaching teams, managers and players, just end up throwing punches everywhere. It's Murphy in the 1980s all
Brilliant.
over again.
Does Poch do well?
I can't actually remember seeing him in the melee, actually.
Right, that's
I don't think
a
it was
shame.
quite a Pizzagate moment. I'm not sure he was swinging like that. It gets even worse because the Battle of the Bridge probably could be recovered as long as they win their following games. But then they get absolutely slapped up a few weeks later by Newcastle United, who've already been relegated, and Tottenham lose 5-1 to Newcastle. This is such a painful defeat for Pochettino. He talks about the fact that he never really gets over it. He just can't believe how they fall and how they fall so badly at Newcastle. They don't win the league that season. They don't win the league at all, even get close. And the final, triumph or high watermark of Pochettino and Tottenham will eventually be that semi-final of the Champions League in 2019 when Lucas Moura will help complete a fantastic comeback against a brilliant Ajax
Yeah,
side.
a much better Ajax side than Spurs side. I was there and I hadn't realised I was witnessing the high watermark of the Pochettino career. I felt more I was witnessing the low watermark of my own life.
Ouch. That's deep. The following season, they don't really ever recover from the heights. Pochettino will be sacked in November. And Spurs, to top it all off, then end up choosing Mourinho as his replacement. Mourinho, the antithesis in some ways of nice guy Pochettino, a control freak, manipulative, maniacal villain of management.
In our Mourinho episodes, we call him football's love bomber.
Indeed. And that's the end for Poch. It is, in the end, a pretty sad one. I'm pretty sure he cried a lot. We don't get to see it because it all happens behind closed doors. But I think the fact that they go towards Mourinho shows that they are ready to end the Poch experiment.
I suspect that many candles were burned and crystals were used for healing purposes.
So, we should ask, why does this happen? Is it just the natural end of a cycle? 5 years at any club is a pretty decent stint in modern football.
And the, by far, best stint of his career.
He's also at a club where he's not just trying to beat the opponents. He is trying to overturn decades of a reputation of Spursiness.
Spursdom.
Being close, perhaps playing nice football, but never being there to compete with Arsenal, definitely not Manchester United, Manchester City or Chelsea. However, I think Pochettino at this point looks back and thinks, I did a very good job, and his managerial stock is high. So high that he ends up in Paris, which is now a super trendy club.
He arrives in 2021 and it's an incredibly difficult team to coach because they already have Mbappe and Neymar, who are guys who don't like defending. And then they sign Messi, who is that squared. So you have a non-defending forward line of 3 brilliant players. As a coach, you can't really tell them what to do. You just have 8 men behind the ball trying to win it frantically and then give it to the front 3. So there's not really any tactics. Then you have the PSG problem. So I live in Paris and both my sons, against my will, are PSG fans. So I get a lot of this at home. The structure of the PSG season is that you win the league every year unless something goes horribly wrong. So they've won 10 of the last 12 French titles. But in 2021, when Poch takes over during the season, they don't win it. They somehow manage not to win the league. They're pipped by Lille, which is astonishing. Massive failure. Then that next season, with Messi, Neymar and Mbappe, he hits the other eternal truth of a Paris Saint Germain season, which is, one, either you win the league or you're massively humiliated in the rare times it doesn't happen. And two, the only highlight of the season is early spring. You play a big Champions League knockout match against a more grown-up club and you lose. And this happens under Poch with that
highlight,
front three.
You mean low light?
Well, I mean, the whole season is not really about the French league. It's not about all those endless Sundays of playing French village teams. It's about the visit of Real Madrid or Manchester City or whatever in February, March, just as the grey sheet in the sky is starting to lift over Paris. And then it always, Paris Saint Germain fans and my sons get horrendously overexcited, and then it goes wrong very predictably. And so this time under Poch, it goes wrong against Madrid. Karim Benzema scores a hat-trick in 17 minutes. The fans, by this point, have totally had it with this team. So Poch is seen as a figurehead. He's just sitting on the bench, can't do anything. The fans are totally done with Messi and Neymar, who's seen as lazy superstars who don't really care about the club, which at this point is entirely correct. It's just a terrible mood. It's almost back to 20 years before when Poch was playing for a rubbish PSG team and the fans hated the team and the fans hated each other.
But it's super toxic, right? So some of the fans end up outside Neymar's house and they're berating him and screaming at him. It's kind of unprecedentedly nasty.
For Paris Saint Germain, this toxicity always has precedent. It's a club where you do have the worst of an Italian-style fan base at times with those kinds of physical threats. Poch by the end is done. He just doesn't seem to care anymore. They do win the league without any glory at all. I mean, how can you not win the French league with Messi, Neymar and Mbappe up front and a club that's hyper-funded by Qatar? They win the league. He gets zero credit for it. A little over 2 months later, he is sacked. But 2022 is the only league title of Pochettino's entire career. So we should pause here and say, I guess, kudos.
Yes, but it kind of just happens despite him, right?
Yeah,
so he clearly picks a wrong club. He is a manager that doesn't need a transfer budget, that definitely doesn't need superstars, just needs highly motivated, disciplined and fit players.
Yeah, and at
he's
PSG,
ended up with,
you have none of that.
Yeah, it's just a bad fit. I reckon he just went for the food.
Yeah, which, is more or less why I went to Paris as well.
Yeah, respectable decision, but really a bad decision. Which means that eventually when Chelsea come calling, this isn't on the face of it as bad of a decision as it was to be at PSG, because Chelsea at this point do have a transfer budget, but they're signing young players. The kind of young players that Pochettino apparently is, the whisperer of.
Can we say that Todd Boehly's Chelsea have the worst transfer policy in the history of football?
In that first summer, that is true, yes. But I think we are... Just give it time, bro. Trust the process.
Come back in 10 years and see.
Trust the process. So Pochettino is being asked to manage lots of young players, some of the most exciting young players in the world. Enzo Fernandez, the best young player with Argentina in 2022. When they win the World Cup, they've signed Cole Palmer. They've nicked him from Manchester City after he has already scored a goal, winning the Super Cup for them. The whole emphasis is a bit on youth.
Let's move on from these reflections on Chelsea. So this is what Poch lands into.
But it's good. I mean, it's just a better fit. And I'm like, okay, I don't really care that he's a former Tottenham manager. That seems like a long time ago. And we end up playing this incredibly intense, chaotic brand of football. So last season, I've ended up at the Bridge watching games where we've been 4-4, 4-3s, coming back from losing positions, getting battered, the whole gamut of experiences that we had under Pochettino, because it's just not disciplined football. But by the end of that season, we end up going, I think, 10 matches unbeaten. And it looks like Pochettino's found a structure. He's found his first 11. He stopped tinkering with the players. And I'm ready, as I always seem to do, is to get a little bit attached to Pochettino because it looks like he's going to stay. And then, completely out of nowhere, he's sacked.
I could have told you that was going to happen.
No, you couldn't. Because
yes, that is how Chelsea operate.
Yeah, but we were doing well. But
that doesn't matter.
2 weeks after the end of the season, Pochettino's fired. And apparently it's a mutual parting of ways. And I'm like, what the hell happened? And now we've realised in the last couple of weeks that what happened was Pochettino was a victim of this now brewing tension between Chelsea's private equity bros, one of whom is Todd Boehly, who now wants full ownership of the club, and Clearlake Capital, the big private equity fund, which is run by a couple of other people, and they're now fighting over who should own the club. And Boehly wanted Pochettino, the other two didn't. They got rid of Pochettino. So Pochettino was a victim of this power struggle. I'm not sure how much he actually resisted. I think when he was told that it's sayonara, he was like, cool, I'm out.
Give me the payoff.
Yeah. a massive payoff. Chelsea will end up paying his salary upwards of something around $13 million until he gets a new job, which only happened a few weeks ago. So Pochettino is now done just after 5 years at Tottenham. He's done a season and a bit at PSG. He's only done one season at Chelsea. He's never managed to imprint the special Pochettino qualities on any other team. And then we learn he's about to go to the US men's national team and make a jump from domestic football into international football. And I guess a lot of why we're doing this episode is the timing, because we want to ask, is this going to work? Everything that we've learned about this guy, about what makes him great and what makes him a little bit sort of vulnerable, and to think, is this going to work in the US men's national team?
I have to say the US men's national team are probably not convinced it's going to work because he was not their first pick. I mean, they obviously would have loved to have got Jurgen Klopp.
They asked him. He said no.
Long holiday, correctly so.
They also asked Pep.
They asked him. I mean, I suppose everyone in football would like Pep to coach their team, but
they're aiming high, right?
Pep and Klopp, not interested. Then they are excited about Patrick Vieira, not a manager with an enormous track record as a manager. After sniffing around all these various people and possibly others, they end up with Pochettino as kind of third prize at the raffle.
Pochettino is now going to have some things in his favor that he's never had. One is actually language. He speaks Spanish, right?
Isn't English the language of the United States?
It's, I guess, the
language. Does this make me sound Trumpian? Sorry.
It's the language of the changing room. But I think in terms of broadening the appeal of football to the millions and millions of Latinos in the US, having a Spanish-speaking manager is not too bad. They want to broaden the appeal of the team, especially before the 2026 World Cup. So having a Spanish-speaking manager, I think for the first time, language is now something that is going to work in his favor. But hiring Pochettino is actually pretty complicated for the US men's national team. One is because he's being paid really, really well at Chelsea, who are paying him tens of millions of dollars before he signs with another club. And so the complication is that US men's national team, if you want a European, people that people know of and who's managed big teams, you have to pay them loads of money.
Hang on, Pochettino is not actually a European.
Sorry. It's oh my God, yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
oh my God.
yeah, you're
I've just said all white people are the same.
Racial essentializing.
Oh, damn. Yeah. Someone who's managed in Europe and who speaks a European language and whose ancestors were European. Yes, Mauricio Pochettino, is that they need to pay him a massive salary. So it's reported that Pochettino is going to earn $6 million a year, which is more than 3 times what Berhalter was on. And it's so big that Ken Griffin, who is the billionaire founder of the hedge fund Citadel, is having to chip in and pay the salary. So Griffin is going to be giving millions of dollars to the US national team as part of a philanthropic exercise, which is going to help cover the kitty for Pochettino's salary. So it's a big decision. It's a big, very expensive gamble that they're taking.
Well, I mean, for Ken Griffin, it's not a big decision because for him, $6 million is like buying a cup of coffee.
But for the US men's national team, I guess their culture, their pay structures, this is quite a big deal.
Now, normally in part 3, we talk about our character's legacy, but I think with Pochettino, the more urgent question is he going to make America great again or great for the first time? Is he a brilliant manager who is going to turn the US men finally into a competitive side that obviously is not going to win the World Cup in 2026, but will not embarrass themselves? Or is he, as I sometimes suspect, a bit of an accidental famous manager? He's not, it seems, a monomaniac obsessive about football the way that Guardiola or Bielsa are. He doesn't have a clear record of consistent success. And I could even imagine him having a happy middle age, just, enjoying Bordeaux wine, etc., without being a coach. So what do we think of this man? Is he a great manager or not?
I think he's not an accidental coach because the path that he's taken is very deliberately to be a certain type of manager, a certain type of modern manager with a very clear ideological way of thinking how football should be played, and the sense in which that he understands men and he understands leadership.
Yeah, he feels their energy. What would he say in his words?
He feels the energía universal.
Yeah, he can read their auras, yeah.
Yeah. I think he's a different kind of top manager, right? In some sense, he's a very modern kind of manager. He's empathetic, he's a nice guy, he's family-oriented, he's a disciplinarian when he needs to be, but he's not an authoritarian control freak like some of the others that we've spoken about. And he's not particularly manipulative. He's a bit of a nice guy. Maybe nice guys do really come last in management. Who knows? I think there's still too many chapters left in the Pochettino career for us to make that judgment. But let's talk about his new job, immediately what he's facing. And he's picking up a US men's national team that as far as I can remember, for a long time, has never been at this low of an ebb. So all of that talk of that golden generation of
Well, they did miss the World Cup 2018.
Yeah, so subsequent to that, we had a so-called golden generation led by Christian Pulisic.
I would say bronze generation at best, but yeah.
It's all relative in the US sense. But there was a lot of hype around the American men's national team because they had so many younger players that were now playing in prestigious academies all over Europe. So we see far more Americans now in the Premier League, in La Liga, definitely in the Bundesliga and also in Italy. And this was all supposed to lead to this climax of the 2026 World Cup. But now that we're only 2 years away, there's a huge amount of declinism around the US men's national team. A couple of weeks ago, they just got beat by bloody Canada. Canada at home in Kansas.
I didn't know anyone could get beaten by Canada.
This is kind of like when the Netherlands was starting to get beat by Belgium, right?
Yeah, I mean, Belgium, one can say a lot about Belgium, but they're not Canada.
They had a really terrible CONCACAF tournament, of course, which means that Berhalter gets the sack. And so now, I think for the first time in about 5 or 6 years, there's a lot of declinism around. And in some sense, Pochettino does pretty well entering a club that is at a low ebb and bringing them off the floor. He did that at Espanyol, he did that at Southampton, he did that very much at Tottenham. He didn't really do it at PSG and Chelsea, where he's probably entering more established clubs with more prestige. So in some senses, not a bad fit. Again, we've spoken about the language. Spanish going to be a big advantage for him to try and expand the brand of soccer in the US.
I remember Americans 30 years ago around their previous World Cup in 94 talking about how they were going to expand the brand of US soccer to Hispanics, etc.
But now they have Messi, so people actually do care about soccer in the US.
There've always been a large constituency of people who care about soccer in the US. There are more Hispanics in the US, mostly of Mexican origin, than there are people in Spain.
Yes, and they, of course, suffer from the thing that many people do of dual identities is often that they will support Mexico or Argentina or Brazil or whatever.
Yeah.
And now the American authorities want them to support the US. And if they're good, why not? I can see it happening. I think soccer has actually become far more part of sporting culture in the US in the last couple of years than I ever remember it being, and that's just because of the globalization of football. Now, there is a precedent for hiring a European-y kind of manager from Chelsea to turn it all around, because Emma Hayes has done exactly that. A couple of months ago, she took over of the US women's national team, who were also at a very low ebb, and she's won Olympic gold with them.
Yeah, hang on. The US women's national team is historically brilliant. The US men's national team is historically mediocre.
Yes, so the parallel is kind of there, but it's kind of not there.
Yeah, it's I would say it's more kind of not there.
And I actually suspect that Pochettino, who again is taking all of his boys with him, Perez, D'Agostino,
of course,
Sibas is not going. They are also going to be entering this, I think, incredibly sort of corporate environment of international football. Basically, being an international football manager is just a form of prestigious underemployment.
Yeah, it's like working part-time for a big salary.
Super part-time, like not 3 days a week, like 1.5 days a week, right? So you only get to see your players every other month or so. And I don't know how super intense pressing brand of football where you have to run kilometers and make your players super fit is going to work when you just don't have access to those players.
Yeah.
So in some senses, massive questions about whether this is going to work.
We don't think that he's a tactical genius who can make the adjustments during matches that win games, do we?
He can do it, but you don't need to be a tactical genius to be a good international manager. Mm-hmm. I think he has so many of the qualities that mean that he is suited to be a club manager. Having said that, there is his example, which is Bielsa. Bielsa does become an international coach. Again, not hugely successful, but I'm sure he's called him up and said, look, how do I make this work? I'm going to have players who have to fly in across the world to come for training camp for a couple of days on end. How do I imprint myself on them? Yeah, and that's why I think he's going to do 2 years and he's going to leave after 26. Even if they bloody win it, he'll leave after 26. Even if they don't get out of the group stages, I think he's going to leave in 26. I think this is a super short-term appointment.
I am here to tell you that they will not win the World Cup in 2026. There will not be a Mauricio Pochettino moment. And very safe, I think, to say this nearly 2 years ahead.
So the jury is out, ultimately.
No, the jury is deeply unconvinced, ultimately.
So far, yeah.
We close our episodes with 2 questions about the main character.
What would our protagonist be doing if they weren't in football?
He'd be a shaman.
Tarot card reader.
Would we like to hang out with him?
Simon?
If he starts talking about my spiritual energy, I'm out the door. I'm willing to meet for dinner, good restaurant, but none of this
You speak
crystals
Spanish?
talk. I speak bad Spanish, he speaks bad English. It'd be beautiful.
Yeah, you'd be able to fully understand each other.
Would you like to hang out with him?
I think I would like take ayahuasca with him or something. I think we'd have to go tripping.
You would take what?
Ayahuasca.
What's that?
Oh my God, Jesus Christ. It's like basically a hallucinogenic experience that people have where they go and learn things about each other. So I think if I was going to hang out with Poch, we'd have to go on a massive trip, literally.
Thank you for listening to Heroes and Humans of Football. For more information, go to our website at heroesandhumans.com.
And follow us at Heroes and Humans on all social platforms.
Next week's episode is The Rise of Diego Maradona, part 1 of our doubleheader on the Great Little Man. Be sure to check it out.
This show was developed by Immaterial and produced by One Fine Play. Matt Cheney is the series producer. Kazra Firuzia is the editor and producer. We have been your hosts, Mehreen Khan
And Simon Cooper.
and this has been Heroes and Humans of Football.